Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
When we look to human nature across time and space, there is quite a bit of diversity, yes, but strikingly, there is a lot of similarity as well. In every culture, cold-blooded killing is immoral. Individuals will fall short of any moral code. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. When we see a near universal acceptance of certain truths across language and culture, there can only be one answer. God made it that way.
Oh, give me a break. Give me a bloody break. The only possible explanation for moral convergence is a god.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of The Most Annoying Religious People. Up for today is the channel Breaking the Habit, an absolute treasure trove of theistic and apologetics garbage. What you're about to hear are no less than 4 arguments for the existence of God, each more irrational than the last. I'm just going to say it right now, you will not believe how this ends. So stick around to the end for a good old laugh. And with all of that said, let's dive right in and get into it. I hope you enjoy it.
Looking into the universe, or cosmos, we notice a relationship between all in the created order. There are patterns that develop, motion is visible, and contingencies that arise. What this argument proposes is that if there is anything that is now that wasn't before, there must be something that caused it. For an example, we can look to St. Thomas Aquinas' second proof, referred to as the proof of first cause or efficient cause. We know that if something, A, exists, it did not create itself, but was created by something else, B. If B doesn't exist, then A cannot exist either. But this also applies to B, meaning that there must be a cause C for B and a cause D for C, and so on. To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense, for there must be a first cause. And the only way for this to be true is if there is a being that is causality itself, existing outside of time and space in pure actuality. In other words, God.
Did you catch it? Did you catch the absolutely baseless assertion? He says that A must have a cause B, and B must have a cause C, and C must have a cause D, and so forth. But that this cannot go on forever, because such a thing would be absurd.
To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense, for there must be a first cause.
Ah, I see. Much more reasonable to assert that there's a divine immaterial mind that exists outside of space and time, which serves as a grounding for the whole series.
And the only way for this to be true is if there is a being that is causality itself, existing outside of time and space in pure actuality. In other words, God.
That's much more reasonable. But leaving that aside, again, this is a baseless assertion. An assertion that an infinite regress is impossible. Why? Why is this so preposterous? Is it because it violates our intuitions? Who cares about our intuitions? Shouldn't you realize by now that the universe doesn't operate according to our intuitions? At what point did the universe instill within you a sense of confidence that it operates according to our intuitions? Just take a look at the world of quantum mechanics and how the observer effect functions and so forth.
In the world of quantum physics, the act of observation can have a profound effect on the behavior of particles. This is known as the observer effect. When we observe a particle, such as an electron, we are essentially measuring its properties, such as its position and momentum. But in doing so, we are also changing those properties. This is because particles at the quantum level exist in a state of superposition, meaning they can exist in multiple states simultaneously. It's only when we measure or observe them that they collapse into a single state. This phenomenon has been proven through experiments such as the double-slit experiment, in which electrons were shot at a screen with 2 slits. The electrons were observed to behave as both particles and waves, depending on how they were observed. This may seem strange and counterintuitive, but it's a fundamental aspect of quantum physics.
These ideas are remarkably perplexing, and to say that they're counterintuitive doesn't quite capture how bizarre they are. It led Richard Feynman to the infamous quote that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. I could keep going here, and I could continue to list a whole host of scientific discoveries and insights which are completely counterintuitive, but the point is a simple one. This idea that the universe should operate according to our intuitions is garbage. So when this theist tells us that an infinite regress is impossible or absurd,
To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense.
all he's doing is appealing to an intuition. And I'm sorry, but your intuitions aren't good enough to establish that an infinite regress is impossible. You'd have to demonstrate that. But theists aren't in the business of demonstrating things, are they? They're in the business of baseless assertions. Furthermore, theists themselves believe that God has always existed, that God is non-contingent. So clearly they don't have a principled issue with the existence of non-contingent entities. All we appear to be arguing about here is whether or not the universe could be non-contingent, which is to say, uncaused by anything else. Some of you may respond at this point and say, but Magic Skeptic, the universe hasn't always been here, so it can't possibly be non-contingent. It began with the Big Bang. Duh. But as I've pointed out countless times on this channel, the Big Bang doesn't entail a beginning for all things. It is merely a description of the expansion of our local spatio-temporal manifold.
So the right answer is we don't know yet. And if you look at sort of the cosmological models that professional cosmologists are bandying about, some of them feature a beginning, a true first moment in time, but increasingly, many of them don't feature a beginning at all. They have an eternal universe that lasts infinitely far into the past and will stretch infinitely far into the future. We use the phrase, the Big Bang, to refer to that earliest moment of the history of the universe where we don't understand what is going on. It's a placeholder for our lack of understanding.
You know, we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. So that's a measurement. So because we can measure the speed that all the galaxies are flying away from us, essentially. And then you can run time backwards, if you like, to find out when they were all on top of each other. And so it's quite a simple measurement, and we've done that. So we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. But actually, all we know really was the universe was very hot and very dense at that time. And we have some theories that the universe was in existence before that, and perhaps some sort of circumstantial evidence. And that means that actually the universe could have always been there, eternal.
So we can't cite the Big Bang as a demonstration of the contingent nature of the cosmos. It simply doesn't work that way. Now, does that mean that I'm asserting that the universe is non-contingent? No. My answer as to why there is something rather than nothing is, wait for it, I don't know. But if a theist is going to assert not only that the universe is contingent, but that, in addition, it was created by a god, then it is incumbent upon them to formally rule out any alternative hypotheses, including the possibility of a non-contingent universe and or cosmos, which, by definition, wouldn't require a creator god. This theist doesn't formally rule out the possibility of a non-contingent universe. Instead, he appeals to the absurdity of these possibilities.
To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense.
But you don't get to just dismiss them that way. If you're going to appeal to intuition in order to dismiss the possibility of a non-contingent universe or an infinite regress, I can use those exact same intuitions to rule out your God. After all, Christians believe in a non-contingent God. That is, a God which relies on nothing else for its existence. So wouldn't any intuition which rules out non-contingent entities equally rule out the Christian God? Of course it would! Unless you insert a big ol' exception for yourself. Special pleading. The Christian's best friend and bedfellow. Not to mention all of the other counterintuitive baggage that comes with Christianity. Virgin births, resurrections, turning water into wine, walking on water, etc., etc. So it's really rather rich, isn't it? To listen to a theist lecturing atheists about the allegedly counterintuitive nature of a non-contingent universe. A theist who himself believes in a whole host of counterintuitive nonsense for which there is no evidence. Suffice to say, I'm not foolish enough to assume that my intuitions are the guarantor of truth. I'm not foolish enough to assume that reality must abide by my intuitions. I'm the one who sat here saying I don't know why there is something rather than nothing. And I'm not convinced that this theist knows either. But rather than admit that, he's using his intuition to rule out certain counterintuitive ideas. And he's using that exact same intuition to rule in other equally, if not even more counterintuitive ideas. This, I submit to you, is ridiculous.
But what if we don't want to look to the world? We want to think about God in God's self. For that, we can look to St. Anselm's ontological argument. For Anselm, it is a logical fact that if there is a God, he must be greater than anything else that can be conceived. If we could conceive of something greater, then that would be God's, not the first thing. Since we're able to state this, we know that God exists, at the very least, in our minds. But if God only exists in our minds, then the idea existing in reality would be greater than our conception of God, but there can be nothing greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in reality. In other words, the very idea of God necessitates God's existence.
The ontological argument. An argument whose stupidity is rivaled only by those who would seek to deploy it in our time. This argument was debunked at the time it was uttered by one of Anselm's very own contemporaries, namely Guanilo. Guanilo articulated a reductio ad absurdum which revealed that the logic at play in the ontological argument can be used to demonstrate the existence of a whole host of ridiculous ideas. Anselm wants us to buy into the idea that God's existence can be demonstrated via definition. He says that God is the greatest conceivable being. Why? Well, if you could think of a being that was greater, then by definition, that would be God.
If we could conceive of something greater, then that would be God's, not the first thing.
He goes on to point out that it would be greater to exist in reality and in the mind than existing only in the mind.
But if God only exists in our minds, then the idea existing in reality would be greater than our conception of God.
And so, if God really is the greatest conceivable being, therefore he must exist in reality as well, lest you be accused of thinking of some lesser God.
But there can be nothing greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in reality.
Guanilo parodies this argument with his most perfect lost island. You can conceive of the most perfect lost island. If you can conceive of an even more perfect lost island, then that would be the most perfect lost island. Guanilo goes on to point out that this island must exist in reality as opposed to existing only in the mind. For if it exists only in the mind, then you could conceive of an island that was greater, namely, an island that exists both in reality and in the mind. Therefore, the fact that I can conceive of the most perfect lost island means that the most perfect lost island must exist in reality. I dare say that Guanilo's parody is brilliant. It excellently exposes the problem with Anselm's point. Clearly, it's inappropriate to attempt to define things into existence. You can include necessary existence or non-contingency in any definition you want, but it doesn't therefore follow that such an entity exists in reality. And that is precisely what the ontological argument attempts to do with the definition of God. It really is silly, but leave it to channels like Breaking the Habit to resurrect, if you'll forgive the pun, completely dead arguments that do not function. But listen to how he defends it. Listen to what he goes on to say about the ontological argument to try and escape these criticisms. Have a listen.
For some, this might sound like a mind trick or some wishful thinking. Surely thinking about unicorns doesn't make them exist. But that's not what Anselm is getting at. What this argument does is less convert atheists into theists and more ground our understanding of God logically, helping us to understand the nature of God. If God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must be omnipotent, omnipresent, all-loving, and completely sufficient in himself. God is not just some powerful wizard in the sky or some Santa Claus-like figure, for these things have limitations and potentialities. The point he is trying to make is that God is not like other creatures, finite, weak, filled with potential. God is by his very nature perfect.
And there you have it. Knowing as he does that this argument fails, this theist attempts to reframe it. He says that this isn't a logical proof for God's existence, it's more about trying to understand the nature of God, and that's what Anselm was really driving at.
But that's not what Anselm is getting at. What this argument does is less convert atheists into theists, and more ground our understanding of God logically.
Absolutely not. He is fundamentally mistaken here, and we have Anselm's very own words to demonstrate that. Anselm wasn't trying to just understand the nature of God. Anselm was, by his own admission, trying to demonstrate the existence of God. He was trying to offer a proof. But don't take my word for it. Here are Anselm's very own words. And I quote, "I began to ask myself whether there might be found a single argument which would require no other for its proof than itself alone, and alone would suffice to demonstrate that God truly exists, and that there is a supreme good requiring nothing else, which all other things require for their existence and well-being, and whatever we believe regarding the divine being." What you just heard is a direct quote from the text wherein Anselm articulates the ontological argument. By his own admission, his goal is to establish a proof for the existence of God. Unfortunately, and as Guanilo amply demonstrated, this argument fails completely. It falls on its face. It simply does not work. But this theist wants to have his cake and eat it too. The problem is, in order to have his cake and eat it too, he has to misrepresent Anselm's intentions with the ontological argument.
But that's not what Anselm is getting at.
But this interpretation, this reframing of the argument, robs Anselm of his original intent. In other words, in order to salvage the argument, this theist has to misrepresent Anselm's goal. He has to misrepresent Anselm's goal of proving God's existence, and instead he pretends that the overall argument was designed just to give Christians a better understanding of God's nature.
Helping us to understand the nature of God.
I would submit to you that this is a case of being damned if you do and damned if you don't. If he takes the argument seriously and suggests that it really is a proof, he has to face the music and accept that the argument fails and falls on its face. If he wants to reframe the argument and pretend that it isn't a proof to begin with, it requires that he spits in the face of Anselm, himself a man who said in the very opening of this argument that his intention is to prove God's existence. So pick your poison, dear theist.
When we look to human nature across time and space, there is quite a bit of diversity, yes, but strikingly, there is a lot of similarity as well. In every culture, cold-blooded killing is immoral. In every people, rape is an abomination. In every society, theft is outlawed. Is this because everyone's read their Bible and learned these moral truths? Highly unlikely. Given the diversity of time and place, given the fact that some of these cultures existed before the commandments were even written or had no contact with the outside world, the fact that these truths are held universally shows that they were not taught, but rather exist innately in human nature. There is something within us that just knows these things are wrong. No one had to tell us. And if that's the case, if there are moral truths that exist in nature universally, meaning that they were not written or prescribed by humans, then there must be an intelligent, moral being that fashioned the way the world is. There must be a God who writes these truths on our hearts.
What he's talking about here is something that's referred to in the philosophical literature as moral convergence. This idea that morality is universal or near universal is something that I could make an entire video on. Clearly, there are very different conceptions of morality in different parts of the world. But let's just run with it for a moment and for the sake of discussion. I can grant, for example, that prohibitions on murder, for the in-group at the very least, are near universal, if not universal. The question is then, what is the best explanation for this phenomenon? An intelligent moral being? Ha! Are you kidding me? Why the hell would you jump from universal moral principle to therefore God? That's quite the leap, isn't it? This is insane. He must know that there are alternative explanations. Explanations that take better account of Occam's razor and require fewer theoretical commitments. Does he really think that naturalists can't account for this? A trivial understanding of evolutionary theory gives us a very good understanding of where these universal moral norms have come from. Simply put, humanity wouldn't have gotten this far if we didn't have certain rules and norms. If we thought that murder, rape, and theft were permissible, we wouldn't be here, because no society or civilization worth its salt could survive that kind of barbarism happening on a mass scale all of the time. Clearly, for a civilization to function, we have to be able to get along. We have to be able to cooperate and reciprocate. We have to be able to build together, work together. If those things can't happen, civilization absolutely dissolves. It just ceases to be. And in the absence of civilization, in the absence of stable food production and cooperation, we would die. So it's not difficult to understand how evolution and natural selection more specifically would have selected for agents who cooperate. Because the thinking agents who cooperate are more likely to pass their genes into the next generation. The other tribe over there who spends all day beating each other's heads with rocks and stabbing each other to death, they don't make it. They don't pass their genes into the next generation. This isn't difficult to understand. Shared universal morality, therefore God, is a preposterous leap. It is a non sequitur. You cannot observe that there's a universal morality and jump straight to divine immaterial mind. No more than I can observe that there's universal morality and jump to aliens put us here. Suffice to say, there is a perfectly explicable natural explanation for the presence of moral universals or near moral universals, something that doesn't require any appeal to magic, the supernatural, a god, or anything else.
Some will undoubtedly point out that there are some individuals in our world that disagree with these precepts, and even more that blatantly ignore them. This does not disprove the existence of natural law, but merely points to the disobedience and ignorance of some in humanity. Individuals will fall short of any moral code. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. When we see a near universal acceptance of certain truths across language and culture, there can only be one answer. God made it that way.
Oh, give me a break. Give me a bloody break. The only possible explanation for moral convergence is a god.
There can only be one answer. God made it that way.
Moral convergence could also just be explained by globalization. We live in a smaller and smaller world, metaphorically speaking, because our technology connects all of us. Social media has made the world tiny. I can speak to somebody on the opposite side of the planet within seconds in full HD video quality. The fact that we are sharing culture all the time through this online space called the internet means that our ideas are mixing with one another. There's cross-pollination. This will create cultural, social, and moral convergence. If you don't buy that that could happen with morality, just look at how it has happened in other domains. Look at fashion trends, for example. The whole world now dresses like Americans, as far as I can tell. Sure, there are exceptions, but I could run a parody argument. When we see a near universal acceptance of fashion trends across cultures, there can only be one answer.
God made it that way.
How silly is that? So it turns out God just really likes wearing trainers with sweatpants and a t-shirt, right? The fact that something is universal or near universal tells us nothing about whether or not it's divinely inspired. And for anybody who wants to resist the fashion example I just gave by appealing to exceptions, you might say, oh, but you know, what about people in India? There's a lot of people there who might be tempted to wear clothing that's very distinct from American styles. Well, in that example, I can just do exactly what this theist did and say that there's always going to be people who resist what God wrote in their hearts. But that doesn't detract from the fact that these fashion styles are still near universal.
Some will undoubtedly point out that there are some individuals in our world that disagree with these precepts, and even more that blatantly ignore them. This does not disprove the existence of natural law, but merely points to the disobedience and ignorance of some in humanity.
So I can do the exact same thing, and yet I would have gotten nowhere closer to demonstrating that fashion trends are grounded in a divine, immaterial mind who exists outside of space and time. Moral convergence is an interesting phenomenon, and it's a conversation worth having. I think that I have some pretty good explanations for why there is moral convergence, globalization being one, evolution being another, and there's more that we could talk about here. The point is, at no point is it necessary to invoke the supernatural in order to explain convergence, whether it be convergence in fashion, morality, or something else. And with that acknowledged, let's proceed.
When you think about the complexity of our world, the nature of subatomic particles, the depth of the human brain, how delicate life is in this universe, and yet it thrives.
Life thrives in this universe. Really? Are you kidding me? What is he even talking about? The only place in this universe where we know life is possible on some of its surface some of the time is the planet Earth. That's it. That's the only planet we're aware of that has life currently. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't life elsewhere in the universe, but we haven't discovered it yet. And we're certainly not in a position to suggest that the universe is thriving with life.
How delicate life is in this universe, and yet it thrives.
What a preposterous claim. What does he know that the rest of us don't? Is he omniscient? Has he glimpsed into the rest of the universe and found that life is plentiful? What is he talking about here? It's just another baseless assertion. Shock horror. Theist makes baseless assertion. Goodness gracious me, I can't believe it. Can you?
When you think about the complexity of our world, the nature of subatomic particles, the depth of the human brain, how delicate life is in this universe, and yet it thrives, and then consider the astronomical number of factors that had to be in place for each to develop over a course of 14 billion years, it seems improbable, to say the least, that they happened by accident. You're telling me that we exist simply by chance? Those are some long odds.
A point of order here. I'm so tired of theists formally ruling out chance as an explanation for things.
You're telling me that we exist simply by chance?
Those are some long odds.
Why is chance such a preposterous claim? Why is this so counterintuitive to you? It makes no sense to me at all. Consider the following. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. The Earth is approximately, and according to our best measurements, about 4.5 billion years old. And here's the rub. Life formed about 3.7 billion years ago on our planet. And given the fact that it's 4.5 billion years old, that means that the Earth was lifeless for approximately 800 million years. That's a long time during which abiogenesis, where life comes from non-life, could have occurred by chance. But this theist wants us to believe that it's preposterous to assume that 800 million years is enough time for life to occur by chance.
Those are some long odds.
What if we doubled it? What if it was 1600 million years? What if we doubled it again? What if it was 3200 million years? And so forth. How much time does this theist require for a chance event to be likely? But in typical fashion, he doesn't engage in any of this kind of theorizing. Instead, he just asserts that it's long odds and that it's incredibly unlikely for life to have come about by chance. Well, I submit to you, dear listener, that 800 million years is a hell of a long time for something to have happened by chance. But the truth is, I don't know how life formed and how it came from non-life. Science is working on it. But this guy doesn't know either. And given that the origin of life is a mystery, it's the perfect gap to insert his God into. And that's precisely what he's doing. This is God of the Gaps 101. Mystery, therefore God. We don't know where life came from or how it got started, therefore God. Chance is an unlikely explanation, therefore God. This is unbelievably fallacious, and no rational or thinking person should take it seriously. You cannot appeal to a mystery or something that has yet to be solved and say that your God is the best explanation for it. That isn't even an explanation, for explanations are illuminating. What was the mechanism by which God created life? How exactly did he do it? What physics did he use? What was the exact process? None of these questions are answered. Instead, all we get is a bald-assed assertion that God did it. And that simply isn't good enough. That doesn't work. It's not revelatory. It's not illuminating. It's not an explanation. You might as well claim magic did it. Magic is what caused life to come about from non-life. And insert all of the other claims. Well, it's very unlikely that it's been caused by an accident. It's very unlikely to be explained by chance. Therefore, magic. It's exactly the same. A parody argument which reveals your God claim to be bogus. And for that reason, I'm going to move on.
The universe is more than a random collection of atoms. It has order, intelligibility, beauty, and even purpose. There is no way that all of this is the result of mere randomness. Christians conclude that there must be a source of the intelligence, a being that is all-knowing and all-powerful. God.
I won't deny it. I agree. The universe has order.
It has order.
The kind of order that leads to disease, destruction, mayhem. Some order, isn't it? Let's take a look at one example. This theist wants to focus on teleology or function. He believes that God can be identified in the complexities of how things function according to a purpose.
It has order, intelligibility, beauty, and even purpose.
Even purpose.
But what about the creatures whose very function and or purpose is cruel and barbaric by design? Consider, for example, parasitoid wasps. These wasps are equipped with a long ovipositor, basically an egg syringe that's used to pump its unsuspecting prey with its offspring. The eggs hatch inside the host's body and, over the next few weeks, the larvae devour it from the inside out, while it's still alive. Why would God design this creature this way? According to this theist, God is all-loving, so there must be an all-loving reason for having designed this creature this way. But for the life of me, and perhaps it's just my lack of creativity, dear listener, but for the life of me, I cannot even begin to conceive of a loving motivation for designing a creature that's so horrifying. And that's just one example. Now, just to be clear, my inability to think of a loving reason for God creating such a creature does not serve as evidence for the idea that God does not, in fact, have a loving reason for creating such a creature. To suggest otherwise would be fallacious in the extreme. The point is, I think it's entirely fair to be skeptical about the notion that God has loving reasons for creating such monstrosities. And all we appear to get from theists on this point is God is mysterious and God has these reasons and God is all loving, so there must be a loving reason and so forth. Such statements are entirely uncompelling, and I see no reason to take them seriously. Suffice to say, you can't get out of this by asserting that God is mysterious. You can't get out of this by asserting that God has his reasons. You can't get out of this by suggesting that the creature has gone against God, as theists often claim about human beings. We've used our free will to rebel against God, and that's the reason for there being so much murder and theft and evil in the world. You can't say that about parasitoid wasps, because all parasitoid wasps are guilty of is acting according to their very teleological function or purpose. The teleology, function, and or purpose that this theist says is evidence for the very God he believes in.
It has order, intelligibility, beauty, and even purpose.
Really? Parasitoid wasps and their teleology is evidence for an all-loving God? Give me a f***ing break.
At least, that's what Christians say. You might not be convinced, which is why, ultimately, in discussions like this, it's important to make two things abundantly clear. The world is filled with evidence for the existence of God, and our minds are capable of logically understanding it, and even the most rational of arguments will not convert some people who have not received the gift of faith. While it is true that the First Vatican Council taught that God can be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason, the Church has never posited that reason alone is enough to know God. Thus, there will be many who will look to these arguments without the light of faith and be unconvinced.
Translation, if you don't already agree with these arguments, you won't agree with these arguments.
Even the most rational of arguments will not convert some people who have not received the gift of faith.
Oh, brother, what an end. So after laying out these 4 arguments and going in some cases into excruciating detail and dragging us through that whole entire diatribe, of course, he ends in typical theistic fashion with an appeal to faith.
The gift of faith.
These arguments won't convince a rational person unless they already have faith, unless they already know God. Why did you even bother with this video? Why did you lay out all of these arguments if you were going to appeal to faith in the end? It is preposterous. It is absolutely ridiculous. And to be honest, I feel rather cheated. I'm frustrated that I stuck around to the end of this video only to be preached at and to be told that faith is what's necessary in the end. Well, I ain't got any faith, and the reason I don't take these arguments seriously has nothing to do with my absence of faith. Instead, it has everything to do with your baseless, bald-assed assertions and fallacious reasoning. Try again.